Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited about the possibilities. I live in Chicago and Ottawa, Canada, so I'm happy to have one last day of winter. You might actually think it's cold here. I was talking to my wife this morning. It was 15 below in our garage, so it is not cold here. So anyway, so I'm happy to be here. I don't know if you know this, but Texas is actually the cradle of the cans. The very first implementation of this approach was actually in Fort Bend County. Now, I probably should have known at the time the importance of information management to support this kind of stuff, because it didn't really go anywhere. But when I walked in, I noticed they had their information management strategy set up. They had this tall gray cylinder that said cans only. So it didn't really work out. Anyway, so I'm happy to be here. You, on the other hand, let me see if I understand your circumstances, right? So you're here. I imagine there's some folks here who might be enthusiastic. And there might be some folks here who might be a little bit anxious about what this means. And there's probably a whole lot of folks who might be somewhat skeptical about the whole thing, right? I mean, how many people are really excited about adding to the paperwork burden of the system, right? I mean, right? So where do I get off? You know, how can I ask you to become committed to supporting? I mean, look at that thing, right? That's big, right? That's a lot of information, right? How can I ask you to become committed to supporting this kind of work? Well, maybe it's something different than that. Maybe it's an opportunity. And maybe it's my responsibility to open your minds to the possibility that this might be something different than paperwork. You have choices in life. The choices you make define you. The choices you make as a person define you as a person. The choices you make as a professional define you as a professional. I promise you, you have choices when it comes to the cans. You have at least 3 choices. You can view it as a form. What's that? That's something that gets filled out because somebody told you to fill it out. In Texas, even the legislature has told you to fill it out, right? So you already know it starts as a form, right? Here's what we know, and we know this. If it stays as a form, it's a waste of your time. You don't need any more forms. I'm quite confident that you have plenty of forms. Here's your second choice. You can view it as a tool. What's that? Well, that's something that helps you work smarter rather than harder. We know that cans can be a tool because quite literally, tens of thousands of people have figured out how to use it to help them be a little bit more effective with the children and families that they serve. So one of the reasons why I moved to Chapin Hall from the University of Ottawa is I now work with a group of people who are all committed to the same thing, which is a way more fun thing to do. So one of my colleagues, Fred Wolshin, did an analysis of the implementation of the cans in child welfare in Tennessee. And you know what he found? He found that being effective is less work than being ineffective. Working smarter is actually easier than working harder. And that's particularly true in child welfare because it's the mistakes we make through poor early choices that end up the major efforts that come downstream. So one of the things I'd like to accomplish this morning is show you some of the ways you might want to think about supporting the use of this approach as a tool, helping people be more effective. The third choice, it's actually a framework. It's designed to be the work. So you see this thing, right? It's big, it's a lot of information, but ask yourself the following question. After you review it carefully, ask yourself the following question. What's on here that we don't need to know if we're doing our job? What's on there? What's in the cans that you don't need to know if you're doing your job working with a child or family? I think what you'll discover is actually there's nothing on there. There's nothing on the cans, the Texas version of the cans, that you really should know if you're going to be effective serving our children and families. Because that's how it's designed. And you had a great process here in Texas of bringing together child welfare and mental health and the other system partners to agree on what's the minimum standard of understanding for our kids. You know, what do we need to make sure we know if we're going to be effective in serving our kids? Because that's how the cans is designed. In an information culture, and we do in fact live in an information culture, there is no longer any excuse for the work and the documentation of the work to be 2 separate things. No excuse. Many industries have figured that out. It's time for us to figure that out. I mean, some people have gone so far as to identify paperwork and documentation as the most traumatic aspect of working in the public system. We can fix that. We can fix that by working together to make sure that, would you all agree, is it fair to say that if we're going to be successful helping children and families, we need to understand them? Would everybody agree information is good? All right. So we just have to make sure our documentation actually has information in it, as opposed to is just documentation that exists for documentation purposes. So that's how this is designed. So that's where I kind of like to start, is what's the framework? What is this? The concept. The concept has a name. It's called TCOM, right? And it really comes from three basic concepts. But let me talk a little bit about implementation. Choose the success or lack thereof of the implementation of this approach, because it really is about leadership. So if leadership supports it, it tends to work. If leadership doesn't support it, it's a much harder struggle. So that's kind of what you need to do. In order to do that, we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But it's really about creating a system where communication is valued, where information is used, and is created in a timely fashion to support good key decisions. That's the basic concept of good implementation. Welfare, the meaning of that is that this is a well-being approach, right? So, and you know, the pillars of outcomes in child welfare are safety, permanency, and well-being. There's increasing evidence that those are arbitrary distinctions that actually have no real meaning, because in fact you cannot have safety and permanence without well-being in a meaningful way. That would be locking a young person in the attic. Safe and permanent, where's the well-being, right? You have to have all three. They all three go together, and they are inseparable if you're going to have an effective system. We know a lot. We know a lot about how to raise kids. We know a lot about how to educate children. We know a lot about how to address behavioral, emotional, developmental, medical challenges with kids. We know a lot. And number three, despite the fact that we've got a lot of really good people who care, and we know a lot about what should be happening in the lives of our children, it's really not the case that we've been able to create systems that consistently work on behalf of our kids. My guess is you actually don't have to think back very far in your job before you can identify circumstances where things happen to young people that probably shouldn't happen. So why is that? Why is it, despite the best efforts of good people who care, who have access to an enormous amount of good information, what makes it so difficult for us to create consistently effective systems? Well, I think there's three things that together, and I mean that sincerely, together, we have to figure out how to overcome. First, we've been managing the wrong business. No business is ever successful when it manages the wrong business. Go to any business school in Texas and ask any faculty member, hey, I've got this business, it's supposed to be doing this, but the way I want to manage it is by having us do that. Is that going to work? They're going to tell you, no. The only way a business works is to understand what that business is supposed to do and make sure the business is doing what it is in fact intended to do. That's how you manage a business. That's true of any business. Second, because of how we've chosen to manage a business, although we have expertise in the system, it's not always in the room with our children and families. And third, it's complicated. So let's walk through those three things one at a time. Now, some people are uncomfortable talking about the child serving system as a business. Here's the deal. How many people here get a paycheck? If you get a paycheck, yeah. So for those of you who don't get paid, which is a significant number of people, bless you in your efforts, right? That's even greater service. Anyway, so if you get paid, you're in a business. And my question to you is, what's your business? There's actually only 5 kinds of businesses. You have to do one of these. Which are you? Now, Gilmore and Pine are a couple of economists. They've ordered the kinds of businesses in terms of how difficult it is to manage. So the easiest kind of business to manage are commodities. So the Texas economy is driven by commodities, right? So crude oil, fruits and vegetables, minerals, those are all commodities. We're not in a commodities business. Every now and then, some of our kids get treated as commodities. That's a really bad thing. Sometimes that happens with disadvantaged populations, that they get treated as commodities. But our kids don't exist so that we're fully employed. We're actually employed to serve our children and families. We're not in a commodities business. You can take a commodity and produce something that's more readily accessible. So I stayed at the Embassy Suites on I-35 last night. I got up this morning, I had cornflakes for breakfast. Corn is the commodity, cornflakes is the product. I thought about the Fruit Loops, I could not identify the commodity, so I decided to stick to the cornflakes, right? So we're not in a product business. Services, huh? We talk about what we do as services. We organize and finance what we do as services. We manage and supervise what we do as services. My guess is there's not a single person in this room who has spent a single day of your professional life without using the word services in a full sentence. But are we really a service industry? Let me define for you what a service is, and you tell me whether you're actually participating in a service industry. A service is when you hire somebody to apply a product for you. So if I spill on this jacket, I'm not competent to clean it, I will happily hire the dry cleaner to do that for me. That's a service. Are you like a dry cleaner? Are you like a butcher? A butcher's a service, right? So if you eat meat, some of you might, but I suspect most of you don't have livestock in the backyard. Hey, let's have chicken tonight, when you go kill one. You probably hire somebody to do that for you. That's a service. Are you like a restaurant? You know, our system is actually organized as if providers are restaurants, right? Think about how a restaurant works. You get your space, you fill that space with tables, and the job of restaurant management is to fill those tables. And if you can get a witness, I mean, people stand out front of the restaurant, you can actually use that to leverage and investment in other restaurants, right? Is our business spending time with people? Did you go to school so you could spend time with people? Is our business spending 45-minute hours with children? Is our business having 2 visits a week? Is our business having an assessment done in the first 45 days? Is that actually our business? I don't think so. I think it's something different. Now the next kind of business are called experiences. That's where you're purchasing a memory. So I was legally employed at the University of Ottawa, and I'm married to a Canadian, so I actually have immigration status in Canada. So I'm what's called a landed immigrant there. So I don't know if you know anything about Canadian immigration, but I'm forced by statute to mention hockey in every public appearance. So I guess the closest here, if you went to a Stars game, you know, what are you purchasing if you go to a University of Texas football game? You're purchasing an experience, right? A memory. If you load up your family and fly to Disney World, what are you purchasing? You're purchasing an experience. The Disney Corporation is probably the best known company for selling experiences. Although I was down in Orlando last year, I did notice there were some parents who were purchasing the wrong experience. They're taking their kids when they're 3 or 4, you're purchasing a pain in your butt. Right? You need to wait until your kids are 9, 10, 11, 12. They'll remember everything at 12. They're not going to remember a thing at 3. Is that our business? So long as our parents are satisfied, so long as our kids think we're cool, well, I think our responsibilities go a little bit higher than that. So the final and the most challenging kind of business to manage are businesses in which the purpose of the business is to help people change their life in some important way. Right? Those are called transformational offerings. My guess is that's why you went to school. Right? My guess is that's why you took your job. Because you got involved, because you want to help people change their lives in some important way. That means we're in a transformational offering. Our business is not spending time with people. Our business is actually helping people change their life in some important way. Now you knew that, right? So what's the big deal? Well, here's our challenge. You can't manage what you don't measure. You can't do it. You can pretend to do it, you can delude yourself into thinking you're doing it, but you actually can't manage what you don't measure. So if you're not measuring the transformational impact of your work, you actually can't manage it. And you can't measure what you can't define. So child welfare has done a good job of measuring and managing safety and permanence, but they really haven't gotten to well-being. And you can't actually manage it if you don't measure it. So here's our first challenge. Can we learn how to manage the business of personal change? Because it's fundamentally different than managing the business of spending time with people. Now, if we had more time, I'd drill down exactly what those implications are. They're significant. There's many of them, and they are fairly profound. But here's one that introduces the second major challenge that we have to figure out how to overcome. And that's the fact that if you conceptualize the business of spending time with people as a service industry, then if you're a system manager, what would be the most rational thing to do? So you have a responsibility as a system manager, you run the system, and you have to make sure people are spending time with people. But you have limited resources. How do you do that? Well, here's what you do, and it's a purely rational choice. You try and spend as much time with as many people as possible. And how do you do that? You make sure the person spending time with people is actually the lowest paid person in the system. Every single public service system, that's how it works. And in fact, I've been in many places where the effort is to make sure you suppress salaries of direct care people, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to spend time with as many people as possible. That's rational from a service system perspective, but it creates a bit of a problem. Because usually least paid means least experienced. And so are you familiar with the 10,000 hour rule? So 10,000 hours, that's the Malcolm Gladwell. He's actually binational himself. So he wrote a bunch of books. One of them is called Outliers, and he talks about the 10,000 hour rule. You can't be an expert in anything until you spend 10,000 hours, he says, in deep practice. So, like I grew up in Speedway, Indiana, but I live in Chicago and Ottawa, Canada. So most of my time I spend in Ottawa. So, I don't know if you know anything about anybody here been to Ottawa? So, I already told you, it's cold, right? It's a very pretty city. It's worth seeing. It's sort of like Austin with winter, right? So, a little bit like that. It's a capital, you know, it's got all the traffic of the capital and university and so on. Anyway, but it's cold. So if you live in the cold, what do you do with the cold? You embrace the cold, right? You're stuck with it. You might as well learn to love it. So the big party in Ottawa is actually called Winterlude, and it's in the middle of the winter, and it's outside, right? Go figure, right? So what happens is the canal freezes over, it becomes the world's largest skating rink, and it's beautiful actually, and that's where the party is. Now I grew up in Speedway, Indiana. I don't have the slightest idea how to ice skate. I couldn't just get on the canal and do a triple axel, I'd break my neck, right? So I looked for a full body airbag, they don't make them, so instead I got a sled, and so the only way I could join the party was the sled holding me up while I tried to figure out how to keep my ankles straight on ice skates. If I wanted to learn how to ice skate, it would take me hours. If I wanted to be an expert ice skater 10,000 hours, it's not going to happen. I simply don't care. 10,000 hours translates into 6.25 years of full-time employment. But that's if you're spending 100% of your time working with children and families. Most of us in direct care spend about half our time, which means it's going to take about 13 years of full-time employment before you achieve that level of expertise. Go back to your agencies. Look at your direct care staff. Find what percentage have actually spent that amount of time. If you're like most places, about 10%. Those folks, by the way, are typically the real angels, right? Those are the folks who are committed to the mission, right? So what's that mean? Well, that means we've got to figure out some way to support people without expertise to do a job that's actually quite difficult. So how do we do that? So now, for some reason in our field, we've been talking about translating research into practice. Just so you know, no other field talks like that. No other field, when they're talking about translating the findings of science into practice, talks about translating research into practice. They all talk about engineering. If you want to take knowledge and put it into practice, you use the principles of engineering. So, now this isn't a perfect metaphor, but it's not a bad one. How many people here have ridden in a commercial airliner in the last 4 years or so? All right, so did you know the pilot didn't fly the plane? Pilots don't fly planes anymore. Well, some of the little ones, of course, but not the big ones. Why not? Why don't pilots fly planes anymore? What on earth is going on here, right? Why on earth? Right? What happens? Well, the plane flies itself, right? Why would we let a plane fly itself? Because it's actually safer and more effective, more efficient, right? So, and if you don't believe me, look at the data, right? The most recent example is a flight coming into San Francisco, the Asiana airline, where they took off the Autobot that came in too slow and crashed the plane. The tipping point was a flight into Buffalo where this relatively unlicensed pilot didn't know how to set the wing flaps in a snowstorm and flew the plane on the ground. Before that, there was a flight to the Dominican Republic where they overcorrected for wind turbulence and took the plane right into New York City. So, you know what we learned? The collective wisdom of how to fly a plane is actually greater than the individual wisdom of any given pilot. Together, we know more about how to fly a plane than any given pilot. So, do pilots like Autobot? Not so much, right? It's boring, right? They're just sitting there. I mean, they push a button for takeoff, they push a button for landing, they push a button for cruising, right? And then they do a lot of communication. And they're sitting there basically waiting for something bad to happen, right? And generally speaking, they don't want anything bad to happen any more than you do, right? So why did the pilots union step up and say, hey, you're destroying the quality of our work environment by forcing us to use this boring autopilot? Well, it's not about them, is it? Right? It's actually about the primary outcome of the airline industry, which is safely moving people from point A to point B. Are you familiar with Captain Sullenberg? He's a hero, right? He's that guy, if you don't know, he's the guy, he and his crew, they're taking off from LaGuardia. They run into a flock of Canadian geese. Some people call that the Canadian Air Force. That's not the Canadian Air Force, right? So it took out both engines and it brought the plane down, right? And he successfully landed that big plane on the Hudson River and saved 147 lives. How did he do that? That's amazing. He's a hero. He and his crew. Well, if you want to know, there's actually a great simulation with the actual cockpit recordings that you can find, like everything else in the world, on YouTube. It's actually, I guarantee you, it'll give you chill bumps. So basically what happened is the captain made a decision, we're not going to be able to land it. If you listen to the cockpit to ground recording, the ground doesn't get it, right? They're still looking for a land runway to put him up. So he says, he made the decision. As soon as he makes the decision, the communication goes silent, because what happened at that point, there's actually a protocol to how to land a plane on the water, and the moment that they made that decision, he and his crew implemented that protocol to a T, including the flight attendants chanting, crash, 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 which is a mindfulness intervention to keep people focused so that they're not freaking out when the plane goes down and they're ready to get off as soon as it stops moving. The collective wisdom of how to land a plane on the water is greater than the individual wisdom of Captain Sullenberg, and he's a hero because he did his homework. Now, is there anything from that story that might have relevance to us? Do you think the collective wisdom of how to work with children and families might actually be greater than the individual wisdom of any one person in the system? That together we probably know more than any one person? Now, is there some way to take that collective wisdom and engineer it into the room with our children and families to support people who are earnestly seeking to develop their expertise to develop it a little bit faster? And then the final challenge, what makes what you do more difficult than what a pilot does, is it's complicated. And I would argue that the child serving system is the most complicated system in the world, and child welfare is the most complicated system, subsystem within the larger system. Because what makes something complicated? Well, isn't it that there's so many adults involved? There's so many people involved in the lives of our children? And don't each of those people see things a little bit differently? So a parent and a foster parent see things differently. A foster parent and a caseworker sees things differently. A caseworker and an outpatient mental health therapist sees things differently. An outpatient mental health therapist actually sees things differently than a hospital-based mental health therapist. What's that about? Who actually sees things differently than a residential treatment-based mental health therapist. Who sees things different than a probation officer sees things different than a teacher sees things different than a parent. I helped raise 4 kids. I guarantee you they sometimes saw things different than me. I was right. Maybe not. So what happens when you have all these different people who all see things a little bit differently? What happens? Well, don't you have to disagree? In fact, aren't you morally obligated to disagree? Aren't honest people honestly representing different perspectives? Aren't you actually morally obligated to disagree? I guarantee you, if you're at work, what day is that, Tuesday? If you're at work yesterday, you are morally obligated to disagree with somebody. Chances are you're pretty much morally obligated to disagree with people every hour you work. This is why the state and providers disagree. You have to disagree. You have different responsibilities. That's why advocates have to disagree. You have different responsibilities. A teacher might say, hey, it's my job to teach these 30 kids. Johnny's causing trouble. Get Johnny out of here so I can actually teach those other 29 kids. That's a completely legitimate perspective. Johnny's parents, Johnny's therapist, Johnny's caseworker might say, well, wait a minute. It's in Johnny's best interest if he could stay in that classroom. That's a completely legitimate perspective. Honest people, honestly representing different perspectives, have to disagree. It's not a problem. It's actually a reality of a complicated system. So what's that mean in terms of how we might choose to think about supporting effective practice in child welfare? Well, I think it means the essence of our work is getting everybody on the same page. Getting everybody on the same page. Right? How do you do that? That's conflict resolution. That's dispute management. Do we know anything? Is there any collective wisdom on dispute management that might help us think about how we could make that happen in our system? Well, there's a lot, right? I mean, human beings have tens of thousands of years of experience managing conflict. Do we have any lawyers in the room? Any lawyers? All right. So there's a famous quote. You know, why do lawyers exist, right? I mean, the existential question. Why do lawyers exist, right? There's a famous Shakespeare quote. Sometimes it's seen as an anti-lawyer quote. First you kill all the lawyers, right? That quote actually, if you look at it in the play, it actually is not anti-lawyer at all. It actually is answering a question. And the question is, how do you create a totalitarian state? First, you kill all the lawyers. Because in a totalitarian state, the state resolves all conflict, usually in favor of the state. In our culture, citizens actually participate in the resolution of conflict, and lawyers represent citizens of that process. So we know a lot about resolving disputes. We know a lot. But if you distill it down to the simplest concept, there's two fundamental principles, two things that have to happen if you're going to have any hope of resolving disputes. First, you have to have a shared vision. You cannot resolve disputes without a shared vision. That's why we have laws. So civil societies have to have laws, because the only way you can have a civil society is to have a shared vision. So all laws are the shared vision for our expectations of each other's behaviors. That's why they exist, to create a shared vision, and it allows us to resolve disputes using that shared vision. So, do we have a shared vision in child welfare in Texas? I think we do. Now, my experience is the further you get removed from the work, the less likely it is to play itself out, but I think it's absolutely there. So, how many of you ever work directly with children? Right. All right. So, my guess is that I don't know you, right? Those of you in the back, I can't even see you, which I'm sure is why you chose to be back there. But anyway, I'm willing to bet that everybody in this room would just raise your hands that you do everything in your power to make your work about the children and families you serve. That's my experience with people who work in our field, is the people who do direct care, they do their best. My guess also is that you sometimes find other people in the system getting in your way, right? Weren't for these damn Medicaid rules, I could cover that kind of stuff, right? That one for the school, I could do whatever, right? How many people are working at supervisory level? All right, now how many people are not going to raise your hands no matter how many questions they ask? I did a talk in Pittsburgh, there's 600 people in the audience. I wanted to make a point about how difficult change was. I said, hey, how many people here consider themselves to be human beings? And only about 60% of the audience actually raised their hands. So be careful traveling in Pittsburgh. Well, here's another effect of a service system. In a service system, supervision has slowly and steadily devolved into a compliance activity. So if you look at time and motion studies of supervisors, the majority of time is spent on stuff like managing vacation coverage, making sure people know how to do the paperwork, making sure the documentation is audit-proof. Rule of the business is helping people change their lives in some important way. So in a transformational system, supervision is actually the most important layer of the system, because that's your teachers. Those are the people who are responsible for helping people to be as effective as possible. Not are you meeting all the compliance standards, but are you being effective in your work with children and families? It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what the business is. Anybody here run a program? Okay, if you run a program, you've got a very interesting conflict. So there's a bunch of conflicts, but one of the most interesting conflicts for program managers is the conflict between uniform individuality, right? Because what do you do if you have a program? Well, you get your funding, you get your staff, what's the first thing you do? Well, my guess is you represent a whole lot of different places, right? But I bet you everybody in this room has the same first day of work experience. So everybody think back to your first day of work, wherever it is you work. I imagine it was something like this. You showed up, you met somebody, they handed you a notebook, maybe a 3-ring binder. You probably had to sign something to say you received it. You may have even had to sign something to say you read it, right? Policies and procedures. You can't, what kind of program would it be without policies and procedures? Well, doesn't that make it about the program? Doesn't policies and procedures make it about following the program? So I'll give you an example. So we were doing an implementation training in a large child welfare agency in northern Wisconsin, and you know, the cans is free, right? The cans is free. Nobody's ever paid a penny for the cans. Nobody will ever pay a penny for the cans. The concept of the cans is that you don't have enough money to serve all the children and families that have needs. Why should you waste it on infrastructure? Can't we learn how to share infrastructure and reduce the cost of administration and free up more dollars to help people change their lives? Because that's what our business actually is, right? So, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do this. The training, so the answer, you were seeking clarity. The answer to your question from my perspective is yes. So there's clarity, right? Yes, in fact, do the live training, the web-based training, it works. The issue is that no training is actually learning, right? The training is just fixing to get ready to learn is all it is, right? So it is the way to learn it, but it's not really how you actually learn it. It prepares you to learn it, and you have to use it to learn it. Okay. So that's true of live, and that's true of online, that's true of everything. Just don't learn it. All right. So anyway, so it's hard to do this well. It takes a few years actually before you begin to use it well, because we have to overcome all the different barriers that have led us to believe that documentation is a CYA activity and not a way of communicating accurately about the people we serve, right? So you have to break through all those old bad habits before it starts to work for you. But it's possible, it's doable. But anyway, we're talking about challenges. So the head of the residential care at this large agency said, John, my staff, they just don't see the value of the cans. I said, that's interesting. Why is that? He said, well, we're in a program here, and our program, everybody gets the same thing. So staff find it distracting to pay any attention to individual differences because it don't matter. If it's Tuesday at 2:30, you're getting anger management therapy. It doesn't really matter whether you have anger management needs or not. So why should we waste our time? Good idea? It would actually be brilliant if we were doing bypass surgery. Bypass surgery is fully engineered. If you follow the clinical protocol, you get good results. Bypass surgery has become a routine miracle. It's not any different than a root canal at this point. It is highly effective. By the way, do the surgeons who do bypass surgery, were they happy when the clinical protocols came out? Well, I'm old enough to remember. This is an intrusion on our clinical practice. But they all do it now. Why do they do it now? Because it's a heck of a lot more fun to be successful than do whatever it is you think you want to do. Effective is less work and it's way happier. So that's something that's easy to say and hard to get to. All right, so the problem is we're not doing bypass surgery. The reason why bypass surgery can be fully engineered is the patient population is extremely homogeneous. It's relatively healthy adults with one of our occluded arteries. If you follow the clinical protocol, you get a good result. Well, we can't do bypass surgery. You will never fully engineer child. You can't, because you can't actually engineer a relationship. So you might notice how the cans is structured. It's structured representing the fact that you actually can't engineer a relationship. You can engineer information that comes out of the relationship, but you can't engineer a relationship because it's too diverse. You take 10 kids who are survivors of sexual abuse, you have 10 different stories. You have 10 parents with a substance use problem, you have 10 different stories. You have 10 kids with ADHD, you have 10 different stories, right? So the diversity of the children we serve is far too great to ever be able to fully engineer that aspect of the work. So you need a model that allows you to adjust, because if you don't adjust and do different things for different people, you end up using what I call the generic model of fairness, which is in fact the moral justification for programs. We're fair, we treat everybody the same. That's the generic model of fairness. So, for instance, in child welfare, it's not uncommon for everybody to get parent training. What if they don't need parent training, right? In fact, what we now know is if you give parent training to people who don't need it, not only do you insult them, right, but you damage the relationship, and then your ability to get them to do other things is limited because you've already asked them to do something that makes no sense, right? So matching what you do to what people need, you have to have a model, otherwise you're not going to be effective. So I'll give you an example. My parents raised 4 kids. How many people have kids? Okay, just so you know, my parents were married for 60, unfortunately my mother passed this year, but before she passed, she and my father were married for 64 years. That's a long time, that's good. They raised 4 kids. Just so you know, it wasn't until their 49th year of marriage that all 4 of their kids was independent from them. So, it is a commitment. So this plan for long. Anyway, right? That, by the way, has implications for child welfare, because sometimes we believe, oh, we're done at 18, you're done. Not really, right? Anyway, so, but they're good people, right? My parents are good people. They had a number of significant values that they wanted to live by. One of those values is they wanted to treat their 4 children fairly, but they used the generic model of fairness. So in other words, they tried to treat all 4 of us as the same. And I'll tell you, as one of the kids, sometimes it got weird. So I'll give you an example. My brother got his PhD, my parents decided to get him golf clubs. A couple years later, I got my PhD because my folks tell me, golf clubs. Now ask me, do I play golf? No, I don't play golf. So sometimes giving everybody the same thing doesn't make any sense. But we do it because that's how programs work, and we guarantee our ineffectiveness. We guarantee it. So you have to have a model that allows you to treat different people differently and still perceive it as fair. Now let's move one last step away from the people we serve. Let's move up to the system level. So how do most systems in the U.S. make most of their decisions? Who gets the money, right? It's an allocation of resources. And based on what do people make decisions on who gets the money? The activities of professionals, right? Patterns of historical utilization. Why? What happened? Remember what the business is. The business is helping people change their life in some important way. What happened that we've ended up with a system that's about the allocation of dollars based on the activities of professionals? You can't manage what you don't measure. You can't do it. What do we measure really, really, really well? Dollars, right? I guarantee you there are people in prison in Texas for failing to measure dollars with reliability and validity. What's the next best thing we measure? The activity of professionals, right? I guarantee you, those of you who are in direct care, you spend a bit of your time filling out forms about how you spend your time, don't you? Right? So what information do policymakers have when they're making their choices? They have information they trust about dollars. They have information they trust about the activities of professionals. What's missing? Where are the kids? How on earth can you possibly expect somebody at the state level to make decisions exactly like those of you who work directly with children and families do based on the best interest of children and families if they have no information about it? It's not possible. It's actually impossible. So if you want a system in which no matter where you sit, you can come back to the basic fundamental choice, let's try and make our choices informed by the best interests of the people we serve. The only way that's possible is if for the people who need it the least, people who do direct care, take it upon themselves to create and communicate the shared vision so it's available at every table. Whether that's a table that's a child-family team, whether that's supervision, whether that's program management, whether that's system management, let's create a system where no matter where you sit, you can come back and make your decisions informed by the best interests of children and families. That's what the CANS is, and that's all it is. All it is a common language strategy so that we can get everybody on the same page and we can always try to make our choices informed by our kids and families. That's all it is.